Right there, Grant, they dating out.
You need to calm down, sir.
Don't tell me to calm down. You know what you did.
Louisville's waterfront park shimmered in the summer sun, a peaceful place where justice should have felt safe. But for Aisha Carter, a 44-year-old black public defender with 20 years of courtroom battles under her belt, that peace was about to be shattered. She sat on a park bench, case files in hand, when icy agents closed in. Papers now barked, Agent Holt. "I'm a U.S. citizen," Aisha replied calmly. But he didn't care. His fists flew. Cuffs bit her wrists. Blood dripped onto the concrete. What he didn't know, the woman he humiliated was a city icon. A storm was coming. Can one woman's truth shake the system? If this moves you, share it. Where are you watching from? Comment. Under the summer glare of Louisville's waterfront park, the air shimmered over the Ohio River like a mirage. Aisha Carter sat on a worn wooden bench, her legs crossed neatly, a manila folder resting on her lap. She flipped through the pages with quiet focus, her brown eyes scanning line after line of public defender case notes, names, court dates, injustices, stacked like bricks. Around her, families strolled, kids laughed near fountains, couples shared ice cream. But for Aisha, this moment wasn't leisure. It was armor, preparation, truth. She wore her usual navy blue dress with short sleeves, modest heels, and a silver pin that once belonged to her grandmother. Her locks were pulled back into a low bun, the same style she wore in court on marches and funerals. She had served Louisville for 20 years, fighting for clients others forgot. Her presence here wasn't unusual, but to someone watching from afar, she didn't look like someone who belonged. A black SUV crept down the street bordering the park. Inside, icy, Agent Mark Holt tapped the dashboard impatiently, his jaw clenched. He'd received a call. Suspicious woman loitering near the fountain. That was all it took. No name, no crime. Just a description: black, female, alone, target acquired. Holt muttered into his radio, tightening his grip on the steering wheel. Agent Lisa Grant sat beside him, uneasy. "Are we sure this is the right protocol?" Holt shot her a look. "You got doubts?" "We don't have time for doubts. Just do your job." The SUV stopped. Doors swung open. Aisha didn't flinch when she heard the crunch of boots behind her. She sensed it. That shift in the air. The kind of silence that came before a storm. "Papers." Holt barked, his voice slicing through the park's calm like a blade. Aisha turned slowly, her brow lifting. "Excuse me. Identification. Immigration status. Now." She rose to her feet, standing just a few inches taller than him in her heels. Calm. Controlled. "I'm a United States citizen, and a public defender for Jefferson County." "Who are you?" Holt stepped closer, lips curling. "Not likely." Agent Grant hesitated. "Sir." Holt waved her off. Families nearby turned to look. A child dropped their toy. A couple stood frozen. Aisha noticed them. She knew the script. She'd heard too many clients describe this same moment. She reached into her purse slowly, deliberately, and handed over her ID. "This says everything you need to know." Holt barely looked at it. "Fake. You're under suspicion. Hands on the bench." Aisha blinked. "That ID is real. I've practiced law in this city for 2 decades. You're making a mistake." He smirked. "You think I care what stories you tell I said hands on the bench? I will not." His eyes narrowed. "Then you're resisting." Before she could move, his hand shot out. Aisha sidestepped, her body nimble from years of morning yoga and courtroom pacing. His hand missed her face by inches. Gasps echoed across the park. Agent Grant stepped forward, alarmed. "Sir, we need to pause. This doesn't look right." Holt ignored her. "Shut up, black liar." And with that, he snapped the cuffs on her wrists, metal biting flesh. Blood traced a line down her forearm, glinting in the sun. Someone shouted. A woman pulled out her phone. "That's Aisha Carter. She's a public defender." A hush spread across the park like ripples in the river. Lisa Grant stood frozen. her hands trembling. Eyes locked on the blood. She whispered almost to herself, "What are we doing?" Aisha stood tall, wrists bound, breath steady. You just made the worst mistake of your career, and in that moment, with a crowd watching and a camera rolling, the seeds of a reckoning were planted. The next morning, sunlight poured through the courthouse rotunda like liquid gold. Aisha Carter stood in front of a packed conference room holding a coffee she hadn't sipped. Her voice rang clear. Justice is for all always, not just for those who can afford it. Her colleagues stood scattered around the table, young attorneys, seasoned clerks, and a few jaded public servants who still believed at least when she was speaking. Someone clapped. Someone else wiped away a tear. Aisha glanced down at the framed award beside her, a Courier-Journal Legal Courage citation glass still smudged from last year's ceremony. They'd called her the People's Protector, but even that didn't stop ICE from dragging her into cuffs the day before. You don't fight systems, she had told her interns, by screaming louder. You fight them by showing up case after case without flinching. She stayed behind, after the meeting, organizing briefs. In the hallway, a janitor passed with his mop, nodding respectfully. "Morning, Ms. Carter." "Morning, Eddie," she said, flashing a smile. "Tell your daughter I'm still saving her a seat at Howard." "You're too kind," he chuckled, rolling his cart away. As Aisha walked out onto Jefferson Street, she passed the newsstand where her face-eyes, steely mouth set, looked back from the Courier's front page. The photo was from a protest 2 years ago. The headline read, "Public Defender Fights for the Forgotten." She hated the word forgotten. No one was truly forgotten, just buried under bureaucracy. A woman sitting on a bus bench called out, "Hey, Aisha Carter, right?" Aisha turned. "Yes." "You helped my son Tariq when they tried to charge him for stealing his own backpack. You remember that?" She did. Not the face, not the name, but the file. "He's the one who got into Lincoln Tech, right? That's him. Got a job now. Said you saved his life. We pray for you every night." Aisha smiled, warmth fighting the chill in her chest. "Tell him to keep rising. I'm proud of him." But pride didn't erase the sting in her wrists. The skin was still red, still raw from the cuffs. Every time she stretched her fingers, she felt the metal again. Back at her office, she tried to bury herself in work, but Holt's voice echoed in her mind. "Shut up, black liar." She looked down at her hands. They weren't shaking, but her breath was too even, too controlled, like a soldier holding fire. That evening, she drove to her mother's house on West Broadway. The porch light flickered. The steps creaked beneath her heels. "Baby, you didn't have to come," her mother said, letting her inside. "I wanted to see you." Her mother poured sweet tea, the kind Aisha always said was too sugary. "You okay?" Aisha sat tired but poised. "They cuffed me, Mama. Right there in the park. Said I didn't belong." Her mother's hands trembled as she set the cup down. "Oh, Lord. I told them I'm a citizen. Showed my badge, my ID. They didn't care. They saw your skin before they saw your name." Aisha nodded slowly. "I thought we'd made progress." Her mother leaned forward. "Progress doesn't erase hate. It just delays its reach." Outside, sirens wailed in the distance. A train groaned across rusted tracks. Aisha stared into her tea, its surface trembling from the weight of everything unsaid. "Mama," she whispered, "what if I'm not enough anymore? What if fighting isn't changing anything?" Her mother reached across the table, touched her hand. "You're not supposed to win every time, baby. You're supposed to stand. And when the standing gets too heavy, you lean on the people you've lifted." Aisha didn't cry, but something inside her softened like clay before the kiln. Later that night, she stood in the bathroom, sleeves rolled up, staring at the dark bruises circling her wrists. She didn't touch them. She simply looked and remembered every name that had passed through her courtroom. She whispered them out loud, one by one. Then she pulled her sleeves back down, tightened her bun, and said, "Let's get to work." She returned to Waterfront Park 3 days later. It wasn't about reclaiming the space. It wasn't about proving anything to Agent Holt or the system that bred him. Aisha returned because this was still her city, her park, and no one would scare her out of the place where she'd once walked with her father years ago before law school, and long before she understood what it meant to be both black and powerful in a system that still wanted you small. The bench was still there, unmarked, ordinary, but to her it had become something sacred, a place where truth had bled onto the pavement and silence had cracked open. She sat. She breathed. A man passing with his daughter stopped short. Ms. Carter Aisha looked up. Yes, you don't know me, but I was here, the day it happened. He hesitated, glanced down at his daughter, maybe 9 years old, curls tied with pink barrettes. I told her about you, he continued. Told her what courage looks like. Told her that silence isn't strength, but standing is. Aisha's eyes softened. Thank you. The man nodded. We're with you. That small exchange followed her home like a light in the dark. But beneath it, she felt the tremble of something bigger, an unease beginning to ripple through the city, and through ice. Mark Holt sat stiffly at his desk inside a stark federal building off Main Street. His office was cold, sterile, stained with decades of procedural indifference. The video from the park had surfaced, not on official channels but on a bystander's phone uploaded to TikTok, then Twitter, then the local news. The title read, Black Woman Detained for Sitting Turns Out She's a Top Lawyer. Mark watched it once, then again. His face was unreadable, but his fingers tapped harder each time he hit replay. Do you want to talk about it? Agent Lisa Grant asked from the doorway. He didn't look at her. It's being taken out of context. Grant stepped in. She was telling you who she was. You didn't listen. She was lying. No, Grant said, voice tightening. She wasn't. I looked her up. Mark stood suddenly, knocking over a cup of pens. You undermining me now, I'm following facts, she said quietly. Something you stopped doing the moment she said she was a public defender and you called her a fraud. Mark's jaw clenched. This is exactly why people don't trust us, because we get blamed when someone doesn't cooperate. She cooperated, Grant replied. You escalated. Silence thickened the room. Then softly Grant said, You should have seen the girl in the crowd filming it. She was crying, maybe 10 years old. Probably thought that could be her mom one day. Mark turned away. Close the door on your way out. But Grant didn't close the door. Not all the way. Back at her office, Aisha moved with purpose. Her inbox overflowed with messages, former clients, activists, even judges. Some sent flowers. Some sent statements of support. But the most powerful were the quiet notes typed, handwritten, whispered in hallways. I saw you. I believe you. You're not alone. Still, the bruise on her wrist hadn't faded. And neither had the sting. That night, she sat with her mentee Maria, a second-year law student from the West End, full of fire and questions. Why didn't you sue them already? Maria asked. Because the fight's bigger than a lawsuit. But they humiliated you. Aisha sipped her tea. They tried. Maria's brows furrowed. So, what now? Aisha stared out the window. The city lights blinked like beacons across the skyline. Now, I remind them who I am. Not through press. Not through payback, through truth. Maria leaned forward. How? By speaking. Everywhere. By showing up where they don't expect me, and by making sure the next black girl who sits on a bench in her own city doesn't get treated like she doesn't belong. Maria nodded slowly. Then I'm walking with you. Aisha smiled. Good, because I'm not done walking yet. It happened so fast the bystanders didn't know whether to flinch or film. Mark Holt's voice boomed again through Waterfront Park. You're under federal investigation. Non-compliance is a felony. Aisha stood her ground. You're escalating a situation that doesn't need to be. I'm not going to run. I'm not a threat. He stepped forward, his stance, wide eyes narrowing. I said, hands on the bench. Her voice didn't rise, but it sharpened. You are out of line. I'm a public defender. You're detaining an officer of the court without cause." "Not likely," he muttered, stepping close enough for his badge to brush her shoulder. "You fit a profile. That's enough." Aisha stared at him. What profile? Black and breathing, that hit him, not with force, but with truth. Something in his face twisted. He drew back a fist. Gasps rang out across the grass. A woman screamed. Someone dropped their phone, but Aisha moved. She didn't swing or shove. She stepped to the side just enough to let the punch swing through air. Holt stumbled forward. His hand scraped her briefcase as it fell to the ground, papers scattering like leaves in wind. Cameras were already rolling. "Stop. What are you doing?" someone shouted. A man in a security jacket started jogging toward the scene. But Holt wasn't done. He grabbed her arm with both hands, yanked it behind her back. The cuffs clicked too tight. One edge cut into her skin. "You don't talk to me like that," he spat. Blood ran down her wrist, dripping onto the sidewalk. Agent Lisa Grant stood 10 feet away, frozen hands half raised. "Mark." "She's not resisting. I said she's under suspicion," he barked. She refused compliance. She gave her ID. Grant snapped. "You didn't even look at it." Mark didn't respond. His breathing had changed. Shallow. Quick, not professional personal. Aisha didn't cry out, even as the steel bit deeper. Her voice was low but fierce. "This is how systems fall, not in a courtroom, not from a verdict, but from people like you proving the truth with your own hands." A teenage girl across the field had pulled out her phone, trembling but determined. "Is she bleeding?" she whispered into the lens. A man in business slacks shouted, "She's a lawyer. I've seen her in court." The crowd shifted. It wasn't just curiosity now, it was outrage. Lisa stepped forward. "We need to de-escalate." "Stay out of this, Holt." Warned voice cracking. "I won't," she said. Isha turned her head just enough to meet Lisa's eyes. "You have a choice." And Lisa knew it. Her hand hovered near her own radio thumb, trembling over the transmit button. Mark shoved Aisha down onto the bench, forcing her to sit with her arms locked behind her. She winced, but didn't yell. Didn't give him that. The cuffs left indentations, red deepening to purple. Blood dried around the edges like a cruel outline. "Call it in," Holt ordered. Lisa didn't move. "I said, call it in." "I think you've already done enough," she replied softly. Silence swallowed the park. The teenage girl recording wiped a tear off her cheek. She didn't even flinch, she whispered. And Aisha didn't. She sat tall, shoulders square, blood trickling down like ink on a verdict. Somewhere in the chaos, the sound of sirens began to rise not from ice, but from the Louisville Police Department, already alerted by onlookers who had dialed 911. Holt turned his head, jaw twitching. "This isn't over." "No," Aisha said, her voice a low hum of truth. "It's just beginning." The detention center loomed like a forgotten wing of justice. Gray walls, flickering lights, air thick with silence. Aisha sat alone on a steel bench in a holding room meant for temporary intake. But nothing about it felt temporary. The cold felt permanent. The humiliation soaked into her skin like damp concrete. The cuffs had finally been removed, but her wrists still bore their mark, one raw and crusted, the other bruised in a perfect oval. A steel door creaked open. A man in a cheap uniform entered, holding a clipboard. "Name." She didn't answer. "I said name." Aisha stared ahead, her voice quiet but clear. "I've given it 6 times. You're just not listening." The man grunted, jotted something down, and left. The door slammed shut behind him. She leaned back against the wall, exhaling slowly. Not crying, not shaking, just breathing, counting, remembering. She remembered Jerome, a teenage client locked in this very same facility 5 years ago for walking home with a hoodie on. She remembered Tasha arrested during a protest with nothing but a poster board in her hand. And now she was here, sitting on the same metal bench, breathing the same recycled air. Aisha glanced up at the ceiling. There were no clocks. Time had no meaning in a place built to make people disappear in plain sight. A woman across the room wept softly, clutching a child no older than 4. Aisha's chest tightened. She stood and walked to the corner, her bare feet cold on the tile. "Do you need water?" she asked the woman. The woman flinched at first, then nodded. Aisha tapped the call button. Nothing. "I'll get it for her," she said aloud, though no one was watching. She walked to the tiny sink, bolted to the wall, filled a paper cup, and brought it back. The woman whispered, "Thank you." Aisha nodded, crouching to the child's eye level. "You're okay. Just stay close to your mama." The girl clung tighter. The next few hours, blurred fingerprints, mugshots. Questions she'd already answered silence after every statement of truth. But the worst part wasn't the process. It was how normal it all felt. Every indignity so practiced, so rehearsed, that it no longer shocked the officers delivering it. They led her down a narrow hallway and placed her in a cell lit by a single buzzing bulb. She was alone. There was no bed, just a cot bolted to the wall and a toilet without a seat. She sat on the edge of the cot, back straight, and pulled her knees up to her chest. It reminded her of being 7, curled under her grandmother's quilt, hiding from thunderstorms. But this wasn't weather. This was systemic. She heard voices outside the door. Guards trading jokes, someone talking about a baseball game, someone else mentioning the black lawyer like she was a curiosity, not a human being. Hours passed. No one came. No one offered a phone call. No one told her what came next. Aisha closed her eyes and breathed deeply, her grandmother's words drifting back. "When they try to break, you hold your breath. Long enough and you'll remember who you are." So she did. She remembered the courtroom in her first trial, the trembling defendant, the smirking prosecutor, the way the jury changed when she spoke. She remembered marching for Tamika Palmer. She remembered her father's funeral, the flag folded tightly, the pastor saying, "She carries his fight now." And now, in a locked room under buzzing light, she carried it still. When she finally opened her eyes, she whispered to herself, "They think this is a cell." She glanced down at her wrist at the dark bruise where the metal had cut. She traced the mark with her thumb, then smiled faintly bitterly. "This is a receipt," she said. "Proof of who I am and what they fear." The video spread like wildfire. It started on TikTok, just a blurry clip of a black woman in handcuffs bleeding onto a park bench. The caption read, "She said she was a lawyer. They didn't care." From there, it hit Instagram, then Twitter, then Facebook, where aunties, judges, activists, and clergy all began sharing it like scripture. Within hours, it made the front page of the Courier-Journal. IC detains black public defender in Louisville. At City Hall, a protest sparked without planning. Dozens of Aisha's former clients, colleagues, and supporters showed up with hand-painted signs and bullhorns. They chanted her name like a drumbeat. Free Aisha, Carter Justice. Now inside the public defender's office, her second chair attorney, Miles Jameson, was fielding calls from every news outlet within the tri-state area. His tie was crooked, his voice hoarse. "She's one of the most decorated public defenders in the state," he barked into a reporter's recorder. This wasn't just a mistake. This was targeted. Racial. Violent. Someone in the hallway shouted, "They're marching toward the courthouse." Miles rushed to the window. A sea of bodies moved like a tide, people holding handmade signs, some chanting, some just walking silently. Eyes filled with fury and sorrow. Down at the detention center, Aisha remained locked inside a room with no clock, no explanation, no rights read. But she felt it. The shift, like pressure rising in a dam. A low-ranking intake officer entered confused and flustered. Carter, you got visitors, a lot of them. Aisha raised an eyebrow. Visitors? The man scratched his head. More like a city, outside. The door opened behind him. 2 guards stood at attention. She didn't rise. She made them wait. When she did stand, it was with the same composure she'd used to cross-examine a prosecutor who tried to frame a 16-year-old boy. Her hands hung by her side, wrists swollen, but her spine straight. As they led her to a different room, one with windows, she saw it. People, hundreds of them. Some pressed against the fence. Some holding photos of her speaking at rallies, shaking hands at food drives, walking courtroom halls like they belonged to her. Aisha closed her eyes. Miles was out there now, megaphone in hand. This is what happens when power is unchecked. When Icy thinks badges are shields for hate, we say no more. Agent Lisa Grant sat in a break room nearby, her coffee untouched. She was shaking. She had watched the video 3 times. Every time it got worse. Not just what Holt did, but what she didn't do. The way her body had locked. The way she hesitated while a woman bled. She picked up her phone, typed in a number, paused, then called WDRB-TV. "This is Agent Lisa Grant," she said barely above a whisper. "I have information about what happened to Aisha Carter." The newsroom on the other end went silent. "You need to listen," she said, "because what's in that video isn't even half the story." Back in her cell, Aisha finally received a meal tray. Cold rice, a slice of bread, an apple with a bruise. She stared at it, didn't touch it. Instead, she sat back down and did what she always did when the world spun out of control. She wrote, no paper, no pen, just her fingers tracing letters on her thigh, spelling names. Tariq, Marisol, Devin, Tasha, names of people she'd defended, people who had no crowd, no camera, just her voice between them and silence. A knock at the door. "Ms. Carter," a voice said not unkind. She turned. "They're asking for you." Aisha stood, cracked her neck, and stepped into the hallway like it was a courtroom. She didn't know what was waiting outside, but she knew one thing. They were finally listening. The air inside the press room was thick with microphones and tension. Aisha stood at the center, flanked by her legal team, a black scarf wrapped gently around her bruised wrist. The podium bore the seal of the Kentucky Bar Association, and behind her a wall of reporters waited like vultures circling a story that had already gone national. She cleared her throat. No script, no notes, just truth. "My name is Aisha Carter," she said, voice steady. "I am a U.S. citizen, a daughter, a public defender. I was detained in my own city in a public park while reviewing court files for a client facing deportation. I showed my ID. I told them who I was. It didn't matter. Flashes erupted from the cameras. What matters," she continued, "is that I fit a description, not of a criminal, but of a target. And if it can happen to me with a badge, a record of service, and a community behind me, then it can happen to anyone." Murmurs swept the room like wind through dry leaves. This isn't just about ICE. It's about how power is used against people of color, about the systems that protect those who abuse that power, and about the silence that lets it happen again and again. She paused, then added, "I will not be silent." The press exploded with questions, but her attorney raised a hand. "That will be all for today." As they exited, Aisha saw her mother in the back row, standing tall in a gray coat, tears in her eyes but pride in her stance. Aisha gave her a small nod. Outside, the streets of Louisville roared with support. People chanted her name. Cars honked. Young men handed out flyers about voter registration and legal clinics. College students wore shirts that said, #Justice for Aisha. But somewhere far from the noise, Agent Mark Holt sat in a federal break room silent. He watched the live stream on his phone arms, crossed face pale. He looked nothing like the man who'd barked orders and thrown fists. He looked like someone who'd seen the first domino fall and realized it was connected to a wall. Across from him, Agent Lisa Grant stood at the coffee machine. She hadn't said a word to him since the incident. She turned slowly and met his gaze. You thought nobody would believe her. He didn't respond. She added, "You underestimated the one thing she had you never will. Integrity." Mark swallowed hard. Later that evening, Aisha sat in her living room alone for the first time in days. The house was quiet, too quiet. No media, no attorneys, no chance. Just her and the soft ticking of the wall clock her father had bought her when she passed the bar exam. She sipped warm tea and stared at her own reflection in the window, her wrist wrapped in gauze, her eyes heavy. Her phone buzzed, a text from Miles. Lisa Grant leaked the footage. She just went on record with Channel 41. Aisha exhaled slowly. Not relief, not victory, just the confirmation that something had shifted. She opened her laptop and watched the interview. Lisa sat across from the anchor, hands folded tightly. He ignored her ID. He mocked her citizenship. He struck her. I froze. I regret that every day. But I won't stay silent anymore. What happened was racial. It was wrong. And it was systematic. The reporter asked, "Do you believe Aisha Carter was targeted?" Lisa didn't blink. "I don't believe it. I know it." Aisha closed the laptop gently, her hand shaking just slightly. She stood up, walked to the mirror in the hallway and stared into her own face, worn, bruised, but never broken. "This isn't the end," she whispered. And deep inside she knew the courtroom had always been her battlefield. But now the whole country was watching. They released her at dawn. No apology, no explanation. Just a plainclothes officer who unlocked the door and muttered, "You're free to go." Aisha stepped into the early morning haze, blinking against the soft pink light stretching over the skyline. Her heels clicked on the pavement, slow and deliberate. The city was waking up, unaware that something inside it had already shifted forever. Outside the detention center gates, a group of people stood silently. Miles, her mother. Maria, a handful of colleagues. No signs, no cameras. Just presence. Just love. Her mother rushed forward first, wrapping her in a trembling embrace. "They can't keep you in darkness, baby," she whispered. "You are the light." Aisha pulled back, tears burning, but unshed. "I'm okay, Mama. I promise." Miles stepped in. "We've got cars waiting. Press is already at City Hall, but we can take you home first, or anywhere you want." Aisha looked toward the skyline. "Take me to the park." "Waterfront," Maria asked softly. Aisha nodded. It was nearly empty when they arrived. Just the wind off the Ohio River and a few early joggers. Aisha walked to the exact bench where it had all started. The wood still carried a faint, dark stain blood that had dripped from her wrists. She sat down slowly, breathing in the morning air. Maria sat beside her, nervous. "They're calling you a hero." "I didn't do anything heroic," Aisha murmured. "I survived something no one should have to." "You stood your ground." Aisha turned to face her. So did Sandra Bland. Maria looked away, voice tight. "But you're still here. That matters." They sat in silence until a child ran past, chasing a kite shaped like a phoenix. The moment held something sacred in it. Something reclaimed. A block away, cameras flashed behind barricades. Protesters were gathering again. Some held signs that read, "Defend defenders," and "She fought for us, now we fight for her." Aisha stood. "I need to speak." "Now?" Miles asked. "Now." They walked toward the crowd, and when the cameras spotted her, a chant rippled through the people like a current catching fire. "Aisha, Aisha, Aisha." She raised a hand, not to quiet them, but to hold them in place. Then she stepped onto the small stone planter box, just high enough to see above the mass of shoulders and signs. Her voice rang out. 3 days ago, I was thrown to the ground and cuffed like a criminal. Not because I broke a law, but because I fit someone's fear. The crowd grew quiet. Breath held. And what hurt most wasn't the cuffs. It was knowing how many of you have been there, maybe not physically, but emotionally. Locked out of your own city, your own safety, your own dignity. She glanced around, eyes wet, but voice strong. I'm not a hero. I'm a public defender. I've stood in front of judges, fought prosecutors, fought for children thrown into systems meant to bury them. And now I'm fighting for something bigger. Cheers erupted, but she lifted her hand again. I don't want revenge, she said. I want reform. A pause. Because what happened to me didn't start with one agent, and it won't end with one resignation. Maria reached out, squeezing her wrist gently where the bruises still lingered beneath her sleeve. Isha looked out over the sea of faces. Black, white, brown, young, old. Louisville, she said, voice low but resolute. It's time to remember who we are. The crowd thundered. Some cried, some screamed, some simply nodded as if something deep inside had finally been acknowledged. And in that moment, under soft morning light with wind rising off the river and wounds still healing beneath cloth, Aisha Carter became more than a name. She became the promise of what justice could look like when it spoke back. A week later, the headlines still hadn't quieted. Courier-Journal ran with From Defendant to Defender. Louisville rallies behind Aisha Carter. CNN invited her for a Sunday morning panel. MSNBC called her a symbol of modern legal resistance. But Aisha wasn't interested in praise. She was interested in systems. Broken ones. And how to make them break open. She spent most of that week out of the spotlight working with civil rights attorneys behind closed doors, reviewing statutes, mapping out next steps. The bruises had faded from her wrist, but something deeper had formed a resolve she didn't fully recognize yet. It pulsed behind every word she wrote, every document she signed. Then came the call from Jamal Thomas, a constitutional litigator from Frankfurt who'd worked cases in D.C. and Atlanta. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. We have enough to sue, personal injury, false detainment, racial targeting, but that's not what we're after. Isha leaned back in her office chair. Then what are we after? Pattern and practice, he said. We go after ICE and the city. Not for a payout for exposure, we file federal. Silence passed between them, the kind that marks the start of something. I'll draft the claim, she said, but we name names. Mark Holt, the ICE unit's regional head, the local field coordinator, the officer who booked her without reading Miranda. And they included Lisa Grant, but not as a defendant. As a witness. That night, the video of Lisa's whistleblower interview aired on WDRB TV. It was clipped, polished, direct, but one sentence rang louder than the rest. This wasn't about a policy, it was about a prejudice. And I stayed silent too long. By morning, legal watchdogs were calling for an investigation. At the same time, Miles arrived at Aisha's office with a flash drive and a breathless face. You need to see this. The video was grainy but clear. Internal ICE body cam footage from a month before Aisha's arrest. Holt was seen joking with agents in a briefing room. Let's keep an eye on that Carter woman. She's been clogging up deportation requests with her defense strategies. Someone laughed off camera. She's got teeth. Then maybe it's time we knocked a few out. Aisha didn't flinch watching it. She leaned in closer, her eyes narrowing like a surgeon planning a precise cut. Is it admissible? Miles nodded. It was leaked anonymously. Probably Grant again. She exhaled. Then, we're not suing. We're subpoenaing. Across town, Holt was unraveling. A federal inquiry had landed on his desk like a guillotine. His superiors had gone quiet. His badge hadn't been revoked yet, but he'd been pulled off active duty. His inbox overflowed with questions. Internal affairs, homeland security, even congressional oversight. He slammed a folder onto his desk, knocking over a framed photo of his academy graduation. "She's not special," he growled to himself. But that wasn't true anymore. Aisha was becoming something the system didn't know how to contain. In court, her lawsuit filing was greeted with a mix of gasps and clapping from the gallery. The clerk read the claims into the record with a tone of reverence. The judge assigned the case to federal review. Outside the courthouse, Aisha held a brief press statement. "This isn't just about me. This is about the hundreds of immigrants I've defended who didn't get headlines. It's about black women who are treated as threats before they're heard. It's about the silence that covers abuse. And we're done being silent." A child in the crowd, maybe 8 years old, raised a handmade sign that said, "She speaks for me." Aisha saw it, and something in her chest cracked open. She wasn't just a defender anymore. She was a mirror, and she wasn't done showing this country what justice was supposed to look like. Aisha stared down at the document in her hands. It wasn't just another case file. It was a sworn affidavit. Agent Lisa Grant had submitted it to the Department of Justice. The language was unflinching, direct. Agent Holt instructed our team to observe and follow Aisha Carter due to what he called disruptive legal interference. He disregarded her citizenship claims, mocked her ID, and made racially charged comments that signaled clear intent to target her. The affidavit spread online within hours. Civil rights lawyers called it a tipping point. State senators retweeted it. Local law schools began planning forums on IC misconduct. But more than that, people finally understood what Aisha had been shouting into silence for years. Lisa didn't stop with the affidavit. She sat down with WDRB's senior anchor for an exclusive interview this time, unblurred and unflinching. "I didn't speak up sooner," she said on live TV, "because I was afraid of retaliation. But what I witnessed wasn't just protocol gone wrong. It was racism with a badge." The anchor asked, "Do you regret joining ICE?" Lisa's lips trembled. "I regret staying quiet." Back in her home office, Aisha turned the volume down on the television and sat in stillness. She could hear the hum of cars outside, the distant call of a train whistle crossing the Ohio. The world was moving again, but she felt heavy. Maria knocked on the door. "You okay?" Aisha didn't answer at first. Then she looked up. "I don't know what's next, but I know it's bigger than me now." Maria stepped inside. "Then let's get organized." In the days that followed, protests reignited. But this time, they weren't just for Aisha. They were for every name scrawled hastily into court dockets, every undocumented child detained without counsel, every public defender called a nuisance for doing their job. At the University of Louisville, law students held a silent walkout, everyone wearing black tape over their mouths that read, "Listen to defenders." At the detention center, staff turnover quietly surged. Several officers resigned. Others requested transfers. In Washington, a federal inquiry was launched into ICE's Louisville division. Aisha was asked to testify. It would mean flying to D.C., sitting under fluorescent lights before a committee of senators and aides. It would mean reliving the moment again, not just the cuffs, but the disbelief. The sting of being erased in real time in front of strangers and cameras and silence. She agreed. When she arrived at the Capitol, she wore the same navy blue suit she'd worn during her first court victory over a wrongful deportation case. The one she'd ironed herself. The one her father had called her armor. Inside the chamber, the air was tense with anticipation. Committee chairs shuffled papers. A row of ICE officials sat to the left, their eyes down. Holt wasn't among them. He'd been suspended pending investigation. Aisha took her oath, sat straight, and began. "I was not mistaken for a threat. I was made into one." Gasps. Pens stilled. "I was treated as illegal, not because of what I did, but because of what I am." She spoke not just of her arrest, but of her clients. of lost paperwork, of language barriers, of bail set higher than rent. One senator leaned forward. "Ms. Carter, what do you want from this committee?" Her answer came without hesitation. "I want change. I want oversight. I want our justice system to recognize that public defenders are not the problem, we are the shield. And you don't target the shield. You strengthen it." When she finished, the room didn't erupt in applause. It just sat in silence. The kind that comes after truth lands. Isha stood, gathered her notes, and walked out without fanfare. No camera flashes, no chants, just the sound of her heels clicking across marble. A sound that now echoed across a nation ready to listen. The sun was setting over Louisville when Aisha stepped off the plane, her heels pressing softly against the tarmac. She had spoken before Congress placed ICE under federal scrutiny and carried the weight of a movement in her voice. But now she was home and something deeper called her. Her mother met her just past security, arms already wide. They didn't speak at first, just held on. Held long enough to remember why this mattered, why it hurt, why it was still worth it. They rode together in silence through the city streets, past boarded-up buildings and murals of Brianna and Muhammad Ali, past protest chalk on sidewalks and flickering porch lights. Louisville had changed, and in many ways, so had she. Isha didn't return to her office right away. She returned to the neighborhoods, the school gyms, the churches. She sat with families who'd been too scared to speak. She listened to undocumented workers who still feared knock-and-grab raids. She sat with high schoolers who'd seen their parents arrested for traffic stops. At one meeting, a woman stood up, late 30s, holding a photo of her brother. He was detained after a broken taillight. They said he missed a court date, but he never got the notice. He's been in a facility in Texas for 9 months. He hasn't seen his son. Isha walked over and took her hand. "Let's bring him home." And she meant it. At the courthouse, the lawsuit advanced. The judge refused to dismiss any part of it, citing overwhelming evidence. Mark Holt's career was already over his name, now synonymous with ICE's failure. But Aisha didn't smile at the news. It didn't undo the fear he caused, or the systems that enabled him. Miles pulled her aside after the hearing. "Press wants a statement." "I'm not doing this for press," she said. "I know, but people need to hear it from you." She nodded and stepped in front of the microphones. "This is about accountability, not just for me, but for the people whose stories never went viral, for those who got deported quietly, for every defender who's been called too loud, too black, too bold." A young reporter asked, "Do you feel vindicated?" Aisha paused. "I feel clear, and clarity is more powerful than revenge." In Frankfurt, the governor's office invited her to consult on a new state-level bill, one that would mandate body cams for all IC field agents in Kentucky, one that would guarantee legal access to detained individuals within 24 hours, one that had teeth. At first, she was skeptical. Political gestures didn't impress her, but when she read the bill's language, she realized this wasn't a performance. It was a blueprint. This won't fix everything, she told the policy committee, but it starts something. They passed it unanimously. And still, Aisha kept going. She launched a nonprofit legal initiative, Shield and Voice. Its mission was simple, free legal defense for the undocumented, community workshops, policy training, and leadership pipelines for young black women in law. Maria joined as deputy director. Lisa Grant became the organization's compliance trainer. She taught agents how not to be her former self. And every time someone asked Aisha why she didn't quit, why she didn't rest, she gave the same answer. Because justice doesn't live in headlines. It lives in the daily grind, in the paper stacks, in the calls at 2 a.m. When someone says, "I need help." One evening, she sat in her office alone, the walls lined with framed news articles and letters from former clients. She looked down at the bench warrant from her wrongful detainment, now sealed dismissed and stamped in a red ink. She folded it gently, placed it in a small cedar box on her desk, and whispered, "You thought you broke me." She locked the box and stood. "No," she said. "You built me." The plaque was simple. Brushed steel, mounted on a curved stone pedestal under the shade of a sycamore tree. It sat just off the walking path at Waterfront Park, facing the bench where it all began. It read, "Here, Aisha. Carter stood for justice. June 2025. Below that smaller text, Public Defender, Citizen, Daughter of Louisville." Aisha stood quietly in front of it, flanked by city leaders, law students, and former clients who had come to see it unveiled. The mayor spoke briefly about progress. The governor mentioned legislation. But no one said more than Aisha when she finally stepped up, hands at her sides, wind-brushing the hem of her black suit. This park was never meant to be a battlefield, she began. It was supposed to be a place of peace, of family, of rest. But when injustice comes for you, it rarely checks the setting. She turned to the crowd, locking eyes with faces of every hue, every age. "On this bench, I was bloodied and belittled. And yet today, I stand before you not as a victim of that violence, but as a witness to what truth can build." A woman in the front row, holding her toddler, wiped her eyes. "We didn't just survive," Aisha said. "We transformed." Cheers erupted, soft at first, then swelling, not the noise of politics, the rhythm of people who had felt seen. After the ceremony, Maria walked beside her down the path. "You ready for the award?" Aisha groaned, smiling. "Not another dinner banquet. I still haven't recovered from that rubber chicken in D.C. Maria laughed. "This one's different. It's the National Legal Freedom Award. They're flying in Supreme Court justices." Aisha blinked. "I didn't know that." Maria handed her the invite. "They say you've redefined what it means to defend." Later that evening, Aisha sat alone on her porch, rocking slowly. The sky lit with a soft lavender dusk. Her mother brought out 2 mugs of mint tea and sat beside her without saying a word. "I'm tired," Aisha finally admitted. "You're allowed to be her mother," said. "Tired don't mean you're done." Aisha took a long sip, letting the steam hit her face. "Sometimes I wonder if anything really changed." Her mother leaned forward, voice low. "You changed, and that's how it starts." A soft breeze passed through the screen door. The following week, Aisha stood before a panel of state officials testifying on the Civil Accountability Reform Bill. Her presence alone moved votes. By month's end, Kentucky passed a law requiring independent oversight of all federal operations conducted within state lines. IC would no longer move in shadows. But change didn't stop at policy. In high schools across Louisville, students wrote essays about what courage looks like. One third-grader's essay simply said, "She got hurt, but kept talking." The local library dedicated a mural to Black women in law. Aisha's image was painted just beside Constance Baker Motley. And inside the public defender's office, now renamed the Aisha Carter Legal Center, a new generation trained with purpose. Bolder, sharper, armed with law and compassion. One afternoon, as Aisha walked the halls, she paused at a bulletin board filled with photos of graduates and past cases. In the middle was a quote printed on bright yellow paper. "Justice doesn't whisper, it testifies." Aisha Carter. She stared at it a moment, then turned as a young intern approached. "Ms. Carter, a new intake just came in. Detainment in Pikeville. He doesn't speak English. IC took him without counsel." Aisha nodded. "Let's get started." And just like that, she picked up her case folder. The plaque at the park would gather sunlight. The headlines would fade. But the work, the real work, kept going. And so did she. The courtroom was packed. Wooden pews creaked under the weight of anticipation. The scent of old paper and fresh suits lingered in the air. Aisha sat beside her attorney, hands clasped on the table before her, wearing a crisp charcoal blazer and a calm that came not from peace, but preparation. It had taken months of filings, interviews, and delays. But now, in the United States District Court for the Western District of Kentucky, Aisha Carter versus Mark Holt et al. Was officially underway. Judge Delgado, a sharp Latina woman with decades on the bench, looked down from the dais. "Ms. Carter," she said, "you may proceed." Aisha rose. She didn't open with legal jargon or emotional appeals. She told a story. Her story. "I was sitting in a public park reviewing court files when I was approached by ICE agents who assumed without warrant or cause that I did not belong, that I was illegal, that my presence required their force." The jury watched her transfixed. "I told them who I was. I showed them my ID, but I wasn't heard. I was cuffed. I was struck. I was bled." She paused. "And I wasn't the first. I won't be the last. But I'm here to say the silence ends now." The courtroom stayed still as her voice echoed into the polished rafters. Then it was the defense's turn. Mark Holt sat stone-faced in a gray suit, hands tight on the table. His attorney spoke of mistaken protocol of national security and officer discretion, but the jury wasn't blind. They'd seen the video, they'd read the affidavit, and when Lisa Grant testified, her voice trembling but clear, it shattered what little defense Holt had left. "I saw him ignore her ID. I saw him call her a liar. I heard the slur. I froze. I was complicit. I'm sorry." By the third day, it was clear where the tide was turning. Holt's attorneys requested a private settlement. Aisha refused. "This needs to be on the record," she told her lawyer. "Every word." On the fourth day, the jury returned. 12-0. Liability confirmed. Aisha Carter had won. The verdict was followed by a federal order. Mark Holt was barred from any future law enforcement employment. ICE was required to submit to an independent federal review. The Department of Justice opened a wider investigation into field operations in multiple cities. When the judge dismissed the case, Aisha stood not triumphant, but whole. The press swarmed her outside, but she walked past them down the steps of the courthouse toward the waiting arms of her mother. At the press conference later that evening, Aisha took the podium. "This wasn't justice," she said. "It was accountability. And there's a difference. Justice will be when no black woman has to prove her citizenship while bleeding on a sidewalk." A reporter called out, "What's next for you?" She smiled. "Building, teaching, fighting, always." The next morning, a new mural appeared across from the courthouse. It showed a black woman standing tall in front of a scale of justice, but the scale was cracked and her hands held it steady. In bold script, the artist had painted, "She never stopped defending." Mark Holt, stripped of badge and title, filed for bankruptcy weeks later. But Aisha didn't speak of him again. Her work was never about one man, it was about a system. Maria took over as managing attorney at Shield & Voice. Lisa Grant launched a training academy for law enforcement accountability. And Aisha returned to the courtroom not for herself, but for those still unheard. In her office hung the final jury verdict framed in black walnut. Under it, a sticky note from her youngest client written in crayon. "You're why I want to be brave." She smiled every time she saw it. Because being brave wasn't a moment. It was a life. It was fall now. The leaves around Louisville had turned gold and red, swirling through alleyways and courthouse steps like whispers of everything that had changed. At Waterfront Park, children kicked through piles of them, not knowing the ground they played on was once a battlefield. Aisha Carter stood near the bench again. This time, not bleeding, not detained, not watched. Just there, alive, whole. The plaque gleamed beside her. The breeze carried the scent of fresh earth and distant barbecue smoke. She was meeting someone. A young man approached, tall and nervous, gripping a folder to his chest. He wore a suit 2 sizes too big and shoes too stiff. "You must be Miss Carter," she smiled. "Aisha, please. I'm Jameer. I got accepted to Howard Law because of your scholarship fund. Shieldon Voice called me this morning." "I know," she said, nodding. "I recommended you myself." He blinked. Did you wrote about how your father got deported when you were 12 and your mom still kept food on the table and books in your hand? That told me who you are." He swallowed hard emotions right under the surface. "I'm going to fight like you did." Aisha gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then you'll need more than fire. You'll need focus and community." He nodded slowly, like he understood the weight of it. Across the city, the Aisha Carter Legal Center held its weekly expungement clinic. Formerly incarcerated mothers brought paperwork. Retired attorneys volunteered at intake desks. Teenagers served coffee and passed out pamphlets. Inside a classroom wing, Maria led a workshop on legal rights during immigration stops. She pulled up video footage from Aisha's detainment, not to shock, but to teach. This happened to a lawyer, she told the room. So believe it can happen to anyone, and now believe that we have the tools to fight back. In Washington, the Civil Rights Division released its findings from the IC investigation. The report named Louisville's branch as a model for reform necessity. Training programs were overhauled. Leadership removed. Transparency mandated. And, in Frankfurt, the governor signed a statewide Defender Protection Act citing Aisha's testimony as its catalyst. Aisha didn't attend the signing. She was sitting on her back porch, sipping spiced tea, watching her mother braid her niece's hair beneath the setting sun. Sometimes justice didn't look like a gavel. Sometimes it looked like peace. Later that week, she spoke at the high school she graduated from. The gym was packed. Students sat crisscrossed on bleachers, teachers fanning themselves with programs, the principal beaming beside a banner that read, "From Defender to Difference Maker." Aisha took the mic, scanning the room. Then slowly, she said, "I didn't grow up dreaming I'd one day fight ICE or testify before Congress. I just wanted to make sure my people didn't get swallowed by a system designed to forget them." A hush settled, and when they tried to erase me, I remembered you, every client, every child, every neighbor who ever said, "Don't stop." She let the words settle like dust after a battle. I didn't win because I had power. I won because I stood still long enough for the truth to catch up. A girl in the front row whispered, "That's gonna be me one day." Aisha smiled gently. When the applause came, it wasn't thunderous. It was steady, like breath. Later that night, she wrote in her journal the same one she'd carried since her detention. She turned to the last page. What they meant to end, they only began. My story isn't about survival. It's about becoming unshakable. She signed it, dated it, closed the book. Then she stood, turned off the light, and walked into the quiet. A defender, always. But more than that now, a builder of something that would outlive her.